very much for the nice welcome. And good morning to everyone. I appreciate your getting up early and being here pre-coffee to listen to me talk today. And I'm hoping that I might say a few things that might pop you awake a couple of times. So I was invited here to talk about any topic I wanted to, and I was pondering what this topic might be. And I've been really thinking about the way my practice has changed. So the title, Digital Blurring, is perhaps a summary of what's going on in my professional and personal world, but also I think it probably represents an awful lot of what is happening in your classrooms as well, I hope. So I'm going to talk to you about digital blurring and answer the question, how do we teach in an increasingly converging world? Clearly I'm paraphrasing Henry Jenkins here, when I refer to convergence, but I think the idea of a converged culture is a great way of viewing what is happening in educational technology. I believe that educational or instructional technologies are starting to converge with other digital technologies, such as the ones we use in our personal lives or pursuits. And the distinction between education and the broader context of being a participant in the digital world is starting to blur, which begs the question, how do we teach in an increasingly converging world? It's a big question, and I suspect one that many of you may have been pondering. Our practice as teachers is constantly asked to accommodate change, such as new ways of thinking, learning, new curriculums, and I know this is something that in Australia we've faced an awful lot in recent years, changing student behaviours and expectations, and alongside this is the explosion in the new teaching tools and technologies. So trying to juggle these aspects is challenging at best. At worst, we drop a few balls, and I know I'm guilty of that. So I thought I would explore these ideas in the keynote, and firstly I'll explore what I mean by digital blurring, and I'm going to present you with 5 ways I think our world has changed. And I think these changes are pretty important, as they have an impact on education and schooling. And I hope these 5 changes will make you think, but they may also make you wish to expand on them with a question or perhaps come back in the conversation after coffee. Secondly, I'm going to give you an answer to the question of how to teach in an increasingly converged world and provide you with a set of pedagogical guidelines. Is it the definitive answer to this question? Probably not. But what I didn't want to do was present a keynote and end on the I don't know, or perhaps we need to research this a bit more. You may not, again, agree, but at least it will lead to a robust discussion later on. So let's begin with the digital blurring. So it's apparent to everyone in this room that technology in education has been undergoing a change. The distinction between technologies we use in teaching and learning and those we use in our personal lives has been blurring for a while now. Many of the instructional technologies we use habitually in teaching did not start out as being designed for that purpose, but rather they've come from social media or digital devices, or even digital habits, which means that they're also probably more social, more collaborative and creative. Beyond this broad sense of how things have altered, I'd like to suggest that the blurring has changed the world in 5 ways. So let me expand. Blurring number 1. The purposeful technology moments have all but disappeared. So we're living in the 3rd platform, and this is a space where the digital blurring has been most noticeable, I think. Previously, our use of technology was quite separate. It was something we physically did. And let me think about this a little bit more. I'll expand on it. If we use the platform concept, it's clear that the way we interact with digital technologies has changed, and this is probably due to the devices we use. If we think back to the first platform around 1980, we used a computer. We physically went to the device, and they were large desktop models like this one. We turned it on, we also turned on the screen, waited for it to warm up, and if it was a PC, work its way through the operating system hierarchies until we arrived at that program we wanted to use. Digitalness in this platform was largely limited to these types of experiences. Mobile phones were only just emerging, and they were large, if you remember the early ones, the size of a brick. Word processors were still iterations of typewriters. And digital technologies have yet to move from the work-learning context into the other spheres of our lives, such as into the kitchen or home entertainment. It was an era of VCRs and beta tapes. Who remembers that? I know I was team beta. Didn't work out for me. It was an exciting time, and as we were glimpsing what was to come, because mini disc players were coming, CD players, so things were starting to shrink in size and becoming a little bit more mobile. I mean, you had to hold the CD players very carefully, but they were more mobile. Then the second platform emerged, and this was sort of around the early 1990s, but it's largely the internet. And we saw email arrive. I remember the excitement of AOL and the little letterbox with the little flag. You know, that was the most exciting moment in my day. Modems, websites, search engines. I mean, in a pre-Google era, it was all about Yahoo. And excitingly, phones were starting to change. The emergence of WAP phones, Bluetooth, it was all pretty exciting. Yet technology and using it was still something we purposefully did. If I wanted to check my email, I would use a dial-up modem. I would connect, sometimes disconnect, and purposefully sit there and do just that. My engagement with technology was still quite focused and calculated. Then along came the third platform, and everything has changed. The most distinguishing difference between this platform and the previous ones was the absence of the purposeful technology moment. Because of the devices I carry and the rise of mobile devices, my life and how I choose to work, study or relax is seamlessly supported by technology. There isn't much in my world that doesn't have a digital device driving it. My kitchen's full of them, my home, my TV viewing has changed to being web-based thanks to Apple TV and Netflix. My music's digital, my shopping is digital. I'm never disconnected, and the web tends to wrap around me and carry me through my day. So the distinction of purposefully stopping and using technology has all but disappeared from my world. And did I notice it disappear? Not really. Now, we could debate the pros and cons of this and prophesise on the damage it's doing to stress levels and relationships and perhaps even how it's changed the economy. And believe me, I do debate and worry with the best of you, but the reality is this is our world. This is the digital age. We might not have noticed it, but there's been a blurring of how, when, and the manner in which we engage with digital technologies. Previously it was purposeful, now it's continual. If we look around this room right now, I would imagine some of you and the people you were sitting next to are logged into something right now. I can see the heads down and the eyes every now and again. And if I was to say, now brave heart, that the Wi-Fi signal was going to be blocked during this keynote, I would imagine we'd all be twitching and fidgeting and desperate to get outside to have a coffee or something to reconnect. We never disconnect, and if I'm honest, I seek out free Wi-Fi businesses when I travel. I no longer reserve hotel rooms with breakfast included. No, below that, I want Wi-Fi included in my rate, and the most important things in my suitcase now are my adapters, so I can keep recharging my devices. Now, I'm not extreme, I'm pretty typical, and I'm continually engaged in a technology moment. So this leads us to blurring number 2. Our relationships have become digital and less real. Prior to the arrival on Platform 3, our relationships looked very different from what they are now. My friendships were grounded in the physicality of my location. I physically met, saw, spent time with, I interacted with my friends. This physicality was supported by telephone conversations, and occasionally I might have had a pen pal and exchanged a few letters, but the sense of location really limited my circle of friends. If you moved away or lost touch with someone, they were pretty much lost. Now, we actively seek out people from our past on social media, like Facebook or Twitter, and reconnect with them. And I often wonder why. I've resisted this, but I watch my partner and other friends who actively seek out friends of acquaintances from the past and refriend them. I mean, he sits there at night thinking about people he went to school with and then quickly looking them up on Facebook. Why? Why do we do this? It's a mystery to me. We seem to want to keep growing our networks of connections, and probably because the devices and programs let us do that with very little effort. But I don't think they're the same relationships we had before. These digital relationships are something completely different. There's no real substance to them. There's no real connection beyond that handful of very close friends. Rather, they've become a hand-picked group of spectators to our life. Now, this blurring of the core feature of a relationship to be a support or a close connection has resulted in a digital network of spectators that provides us with a visage of connections and friends, but in fact I think is less real, it's unquantifiable and really blurry. But this is just our known friends. What about this digital phenomenon of the imagined audience? When we tweet or Instagram or post messages publicly on social media, who is it we're imagining is reading them? This blurry imagined audience plays a really significant role in our digital lives. Much of what we do in this space is akin to a performance. Who isn't guilty of considering the impact or possible responses they might get from a tweet? I know I am. Who hasn't had tweet envy? Again, that's me. We all have that one friend who just nails the tweet perfectly, and they get a flurry of quick responses or get retweeted when our tweets tend to sort of limp along, and it's just the loyal friends who'll actually like it. So why do we care so much about this blurry imagined audience? Well, I'm not too sure, but I tend to think it's all tied up in the competing traits of our egos and how we want to be perceived. Everyone wants to be seen, and that's what digital devices do. They provide us with tangible, visible evidence of ourselves. It might not be a popular or unpopular image, but it is an image that we project to the outside world. So it's clear there's a bit of a blurring in our relationships. How we conducted them in the past compared to now is really very different. So blurring number 3, individuality is less distinct. We now are existing in a strange dichotomy. Evidently our lives are more personalised and individual. Think about our personal Facebook pages or our personal Instagram accounts and our tweets and the digital curation tools that let us tailor our information streams like Scoopit and Flipboard. Yet there is now more group participation and on larger scales than ever before. We join things, we retweet, we join virtual movements, and we participate a bit more. The third platform has blurred the lines between who participates in what. Think about earlier times. If you were going to be political, for an example, you might go and join a party, attend a meeting, go on a march, disseminate your ideas. It was all quite a physical experience. It involved situated activities. Now we do this virtually. We join virtual campaigns, we become political by virtue of the tweets and posts we put out there and like. And importantly, it's being fed by the perceived social and probably psychological rewards our actions trigger. How many likes we get for an action, the headiness of someone repinning or linking to your blog post or a tweet. And it encourages us, and don't kid yourself that it's an individual expression. There's a group think being enacted here on a global scale. You receive the rewards if the masses support your ideas. Hence, we reshape ourselves to resemble the group. So I'm suggesting that our individuality is blurring into a digital oneness. There's another digital oneness emerging here. Our activities online are being used to profile us. Google bases its results on the previous activities, and data mining tools constantly harvest our online activities and our habits to tailor the search results for us. This alarms me. At any given moment, I'm prone to a conspiracy theory, but this sort of stuff really alarms me, as I think I'm probably being herded with others of a similar interest to particular pages. I'm unconsciously being guided into a digital group that I have no control over. And my individuality is seriously being digitally diminished. So this leads me to the next point. Blurring number 4. Our sense of self is becoming digital. Our attachment and dependence on digital technologies, particularly mobile ones such as smartphones and iPads, is, in my opinion only, beginning to impact on our sense of self. Our feelings of self-worth and self-esteem and sense of abilities are tied to two aspects: the type of device we use and our online behaviours. For example, the battle between Apple and Samsung is serious when you're a young consumer. The wrong model can mean social death. We have a 13-year-old. I'm experiencing this on a daily basis because we didn't get an iPhone. So it really is social death in that school. Whilst online, the responses we receive from friends and wider audiences have an enormous impact on our perceived social worth. How many friends, how quickly people like something, if you've seen the latest viral tweet or video, all of these contribute to how others, and perhaps more worryingly, how we perceive ourselves. So the shallowness of these kinds of reinforcers aside, this is worrying in a couple of ways. Firstly, the sheer volume of online reinforcers needed for all of the users, say on Facebook, on any given day is unsustainable. What happens when you don't get them? How do you rationalise such a public failure? I tend to think younger generations lack the resilience to cope with these type of failures. Secondly, the internalised, inwards-looking nature of such indicators of self-worth and their impact are really hard to identify. Hence, we cannot determine the impact they're having. We can guess, and anecdotal evidence provides us with some insights, but how we can understand what is happening when someone is constantly searching, looking, checking for updates on their devices, how are they rationalising what is happening up here? Clearly it's not being done well because we're having spiking levels of anxiety and depression being reported in the younger users. So the point here is that our sense of self is increasingly becoming digital. Or perhaps it would be more correct to say it's being shaped by our own and other people's digital behaviours. And this is impacting on our self-worth and self-esteem. So finally, there's one more type of blurring I want to suggest, and this one I think as educators we need to comprehend and perhaps harness. So digital blurring number 5 is we are living in a transmediated existence. Last year I was lucky to meet and attend a series of workshops presented by Jeff Gomez from Starlight Runner. Now these had a huge impact on me as I had a moment of clarity. I'd been pondering for some time how technology was changing, and it was merging with multimedia. Plus, I thought that society and culture was influencing the way we used it. I felt increasingly there was a move to use non-instructional technologies in the classroom, and to keep describing all of this as instructional technology wasn't enough. Jeff was describing the concept of transmedia and how it was grounded in the work of Henry Jenkins. And at the heart of it was the use of multiple technologies to sustain and develop a narrative further. I really liked the idea of transmedia, as I thought it encapsulated what I thought was happening in educational contexts regarding technology. So let me explain a bit further. What we have traditionally considered to be technology has started to blur. It used to be computers that surf the net or run programs. This is changing. We've entered an era of multiple platforms and multiple devices, where our interactions may begin in one space and travel across to others to continue that experience. The devices I use are varied: wearable technologies, digital devices in my car, such as my GPS and Bluetooth and tablets, laptops, smartphones. I'm trying really hard not to jump into the digital smartwatch, but I can feel its inevitability coming towards me, and I can actually probably spot the people who I know are wearing them in this audience. I've been stalking you. They're all connected, and I don't mean to the web. They're all connected in a more complex way that collectively mediates and carries my digital identity, my work and my life. So let me explore this a bit further. I'd like to suggest that we're now living in an era of digital narratives. We can construct and participate in multiple narratives simultaneously. And this was my moment of clarity when I was listening to Jeff. So for an example, my academic narrative. Who I am, what I research, what I teach, where I've taught, the videos I post up to YouTube for my students, what I read and where I publish, all of this is collected and forms part of my digital narrative. I present this narrative via my website, my blog, emails, my professional Twitter profile, LinkedIn, Google+, Scopus. Look, the list is endless. Yet all of these contribute to and extend my digital narrative that I've constructed around me as an academic. Everything that I do during the working day adds to this narrative, and it constantly develops. Its message is constantly shared, and it's across time. I can go back and see the beginnings of it to when I first got my PhD, and I can move forward to where I am now. And all of this is constantly changing. Now, my personal narrative is very different, and it's multifaceted. Perhaps like many of you, I have an alias online. I have an email address that's not attached to my name to have some level of difference between what my students can find about me and my professional role. But it's quite complex. And if you look hard enough, I suppose it probably could be found. But sitting at the core of it are all of my personal interests, such as who I might like to read, the bloggers I follow, and the websites that I hop onto each day. My daily online habits, my social networks, and increasingly the wearable technologies that I'm using. These all link together to create a very different digital narrative. It's not a complete picture of who I am, but it's a snapshot of my personal digital narrative. It's interesting to reflect on this as I'm an avid user of wearable technologies. I think I have the naive hope that they'll make me a healthier, fitter version of myself. And the devices are informative, but it's the act of logging in and linking them to all of my other devices that I use to develop this digital health profile that makes me think that perhaps my personal digital narrative appears to be a much healthier version of myself than the coffee-swilling reality that's standing in front of you right here. But anyway, so I wonder how much of our digital narratives are real, honest representations of ourselves, or are they carefully curated narratives? I know my academic narrative is quite purposefully created, and I vigilantly curate what is linked to my name. My personal one, I'm cautious, but perhaps the control is a little less. But what's important to grasp here are that all of our stories are interconnected, and they're all across multiple platforms. Also, we constantly use multiple devices to experience, contribute and add to these narratives. We might not actually be aware of this at all times, and the whole issue of digital identity and digital tattoo is still really only now starting to be fully understood. Also, the degree to which we are digitally present out there varies greatly, and largely is decided by the digital fluency of the individual. But I think perceiving your online presence as digital narrative is helpful. And I was wondering why this was helpful. And I guess I feel more in control of the information about myself if I view them as a continually developing narrative. It stops me from feeling overwhelmed by the fact that it's out there, who might be using it, and how I'm perceived. I also like the narrative metaphor as it's something that's continually changing, being added to, perhaps edited, it's evolving. I think to have some control over our digital identity, we need to think about our narratives carefully and decide what to do in this space and which tools to use. Already some parts of society have done this really very well. The entertainment industry has grasped this idea of the narrative. So think about the experience of going to the movies now. The Pirates of the Caribbean and perhaps the Avatar franchises are really good examples of this. Going to the movies is not enough. It's not a simple act anymore of being entertained for 2 hours and walking away. I can hop online, I can see more information about the characters, extra information that wasn't in the movie. I can go to my Xbox or my PlayStation and play another level of the story there. I keep revisiting the world. I can even go and buy a Lego kit and recreate scenes from the movie. It keeps changing and the narrative keeps being added to. So it's not a one-off experience anymore. So there you have it. They're the 5 ways I would like to suggest that the world has changed due to digital blurring. I think the digital world we live in has altered many aspects of our life, but I'm going to suggest another observation. I think we might have realised the much anticipated dream of being 21st century learners who constantly engage in learning. Most of the school curriculum documents around the world list lifelong learning or 21st century skills as a goal. Universities have graduate outcomes containing a similar rhetoric, and we're all focused on these skills, but I think we're already there. And this has crept up on us quietly and without much notice. I think the political and policy rhetoric is rather redundant. And do you know how we achieve this? I think via the devices we use. We're constantly dipping in and out of information streams and learning and reading and thinking and creating, and we're doing it pretty effectively, but we're also doing it unconsciously. So what's next? Speculating on what's to come in a fast-moving space is tricky, but it's possible if we stop viewing everything singularly. I think it's redundant to name a program or a device that will change teaching in the learning landscape, as it's going to be soon replaced. So I want to return to the question that was posed in the title of the keynote. How do we teach in an increasingly converging world? I think to teach in this converged world, we need new approaches and new ways of thinking. The traditional pedagogies we've been using will probably not suffice. Here is where we're going to next, and in fact, I think the journey might already be underway. And I believe that popular culture, media, cultural studies are converging with technology and learning. We're entering an era of transmediated learning. So transmediated learning requires multiple skills, abilities, literacies, and importantly, I believe it's got the possible to differentiate and accommodate individual learners. So transmediated learning does not require everyone to be the same, to learn the same way, to produce the same outcomes. This is both its strength and its weakness. As how do educators harness such an approach to implement in their classrooms? And this is a hard question to answer in a single keynote, but what I've been pondering in this space are some pedagogical guidelines that might help us transform our practice. So here are my suggestions. Learning should be continual. We need to leave the traditional conceptions about when we learn behind us. Scheduling learning to occur at the same time for everyone enrolled in a class is not the way forward. No longer should learning be physically constrained by being either located in a class or working with a teacher. The mobility of our devices enables continual learning. So why are we limiting our teaching to a time period? I know that I'm online, logged into Blackboard, emailing, responding to tweets outside of the expected Monday to Friday working hours. Blended learning enables this, and so does online learning. I'm not sure if you experience this, but my students do not want to come to each and every class. They just don't. It's not a comment on the unit itself, it's just that it's an expectation that they don't want to turn up. They don't wish to be tied to a timetabled workshop. So we've removed the attendance requirement at Curtin, and we hold the classes still, but the approach is blended. Learning outcomes are still being met. Student evaluation surveys are telling us that we're on the right track, they're positive. Assessment tasks are the evidence I need of the learning that's happened, and it's working. It's 7 days a week, it's outside of working hours. Am I working longer hours? I don't think so. I think if I'm realistic, I'm working the same number of hours, but just differently. It's spread quite differently. So number 2, learning should be transmediated. Now, using a computer is not enough. It has to be a fully integrated multimedia learning experience. Think about the ways we capture our students' imaginations and the digital tools we use. They're not simple tools for conveying or presenting facts. They're interactive, they're engaging, they're constantly changing. If you look at the program for this conference, you'll see there's a wide range of different tools and ideas being shared here. Not many of them could be described as traditional technologies. So let's go back to that moment of clarity I said whilst I was listening to Jeff Gomez. What does transmedia have to do with education? So how about this as an idea? I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I think this might work. What have we taught via narratives? Think about a pre-service teacher education program. The narrative sustaining that program across the 4 years is the narrative of becoming a teacher. Each of the courses we study adds to the narrative, and it builds that person and sustains that person through the course of their 4 years of study. Pretty powerful idea. We could also teach school-based subjects that way. In fact, I'd like to suggest it might be an incredible learning experience, personalised, authentic and rich. I would perhaps suggest not whole subjects across the whole 4 years or 7 years of schooling, but perhaps we could organise topics of work that go across subjects and would be a little bit more rich and problem-solving, inquiry-based. They're just ideas to think about. Number 3, learning should be highly personalised. We've all been saying this for many years. And as educators, I think we'd agree that we'd like to be able to create highly personalised learning experiences. It'd be great to meet each student at their current level of understanding and lead them through the content. It would be great to tailor our pedagogies to suit their preferences. But this has remained an unattainable idea. It's not realistic for classes of 30, 100 or 300 students. But I tend to think this much anticipated goal of differentiating the curriculum for each and every learner can and probably is being realised. Technology enables this. The devices that are now available ensure that learning is personalised to suit our preferences. We can modify laptops and devices to suit us. We use programs and websites in very different ways. And new programs are being developed that allow teachers to coordinate these types of accommodations. But importantly, students can operate the devices individually, yet via the very same devices, be connected and collaborate with others. Learning should be creative. Now, there's probably very few people in this room who might not have listened or would have listened to the work or might even read the work of Ken Robinson, who has loudly and correctly suggested that our current education systems neither support nor encourage creativity. Yet creativity is the key skill to be successful in life. I believe this. And this is a strange dichotomy, as I believe our digital world is a really creative world. How could we perceive it otherwise? Look around us, the amount of digital artefacts being created, uploaded, downloaded every day proves this point. Yet our education systems, a core component of our society, are not creative, and nor do they encourage creativity. Now, I'm using the term creativity, yet I think our understanding might have changed. I naively used to perceive this to be the realm of the artistic or musical people in the world. It was something arty that you produced, like a painting or a dance, but it's not. 21st century creativity is something else entirely. It's problem solving, it's activity based, it's collaborative, and it requires a range of skills and literacies to be able to be creative. And at the heart of this lies technology, because the artefacts we most typically produce are digital, and the skills we need to produce them are also digital. So how exciting is this for us as teachers? Beyond planning lessons that are creative, the artefacts we ask our students to build constantly expand exponentially due to technology. The biggest challenge I set myself a couple of years ago was to be more creative in my assessment practices. I wanted to get away from the boring essay. I wanted to do something that was a bit more technology-based, still had the hard learning in there, but definitely was more creative. So now I've got pre-service teachers creating blogs, videos, picto charts, scoop it pages, and their submissions amaze me. It's evidence of hard learning, the content and the learning outcomes are there, and they have used technologies to present it creatively. And I think they're going to be better teachers because of these experiences. So this brings me to the last point. Learning should be a social experience. Now, earlier I spoke about how individuality is diminishing and that we seem to be part of a bigger group. Tomorrow, John will present his keynote about digital crowds, so I'm not going to say too much more on this, but I think I'll just reiterate that online or digitally, we have a clear sense that we are not alone, that we are part of something. And I'd like to examine this just a little bit more, as I think we've moved into a new space. and it's of particular importance to the teaching and learning landscape. So I'm going to get theoretical for a minute. I tend to think that there are three broad theoretical concepts that we could ground our practice on. Quite a few years ago, Mitch Resnick wrote an interesting paper outlining distributed constructionism. Now, this struck a chord in me as I was very firmly in the social constructivist camp regarding learning, yet the lure of technology and what it might enable was also really appealing. Resnick's idea of a socially mediated constructionist learning experience merged these two ideas together, and it excited me. I wish he'd gone further with the idea. It still sits there as a single lone paper, but it's always sat in the back of my mind. And the idea of socially learning with hands-on technologies that produced actual artefacts have stuck with me. Yet I think about distributed constructionism, and I think, could this theory actually be describing a lot of the online activities we're already engaging in? I tend to think yes, some of them anyway. So that's theory number one, distributed constructionism. Keep that in mind. Then along came connectivism. The idea that knowledge was external and located on a network also excited me. I got excited an awful lot back then, but bear with me. Suddenly there was a potential for learning that had just expanded. I could connect to all sorts of information when I needed it and then move on to the next bit. To me, this was a huge moment, and initially connectivism was dismissed as a speculative theory, but it's hung in there and it's proven everyone wrong. We're largely doing this each and every time we search for information, use it and move on. So let's merge these two ideas together with transmedia. And I'm going to finish this keynote on a new definition. Or perhaps it could be viewed as a call for change. But due to digital blurring and the digital context we find ourselves in, I want to suggest that we need to adopt transmediated learning as our new approach to teaching and learning, as I believe that it has the potential to keep up with the constant changes our digital world triggers. So here's my new definition. Transmediated learning is the convergence of popular culture, media, cultural studies, socially mediated connections, networks, technology and learning. So to conclude, I began the keynote with two main aims: to explain how digital blurring is changing our world, which I think I've presented, and secondly, to suggest a way to teach in this increasingly converging world we find ourselves in. And I'm suggesting that transmediated learning might be the approach we use. I think if we view transmediated learning as a theoretical concept to make sense of the digitally rich world we find ourselves working in, it provides us with a framework to understand and plan our practice. By understanding that our teaching spaces are a convergence of all these different aspects listed up there on the slide, we can see them more clearly. We can also understand the expectations of our students and what they have regarding learning and how they want to experience their education. And hopefully, as educators, we can then plan accordingly. Thank you very much.